Some people think the Federal Reserve banks are United States government institutions. They are not government institutions. They are private credit monopolies which prey upon the people of the United States for the benefit of only themselves and their foreign customers, foreign and domestic speculators and swindlers, and rich and predatory moneylenders. In the dark crew of financial pirates, there are those who will cut a man's throat to get a dollar out of his pocket. There are those who send money into states to buy votes to control our legislature. And there are those who maintain international propaganda for the purpose of deceiving us and of wheedling us into the granting of new concessions, which will permit them to cover up their past misdeeds and set again in motion their gigantic train of crime. These 12 private credit monopolies were deceitfully and disloyally foisted upon this country by the bankers who came here from Europe and repaid us for our hospitality by undermining our American institutions. Those bankers took money out of this country to finance Japan in a war against Russia. They created a reign of terror in Russia with our money in order to help that war along. They instigated the separate peace between Germany and Russia and thus drove a wedge between the Allies and the World War. They financed Trotsky's passage from New York to Russia so that he might assist in the destruction of the Russian Empire. They fomented and instigated the Russian Revolution, and they placed a large fund of American dollars at Trotsky's disposal in one of their branch banks in Sweden, so that through him, Russian homes might be thoroughly broken up and Russian children flung far and wide from their natural protectors. They have since begun the breaking up of American homes and the dispersal of American children. One of the greatest battles for the preservation of this republic was fought out here in Jackson's day when the Second Bank of the United States, which was founded upon the same false principles as those which are here exemplified in the Federal Reserve Act, was hurled out of existence. After the downfall of the Second Bank of the United States in 1837, this country was warned against the dangers that might ensue if the predatory interests, after being cast out, should come back in disguise and unite themselves to the executive, and through him acquire control of the government. This is exactly what has happened today on Wall Street. This is what the predatory interests did when they came back in the livery of hypocrisy and under false pretenses obtained the passage of the Federal Reserve Act. The danger that this country was warned against came upon us and is shown in the long chain of horrors attendant upon the affairs of the traitorous and dishonest Federal Reserve Board, and the Federal Reserve banks are fully liable. Today, the Federal Reserve banks are some of the largest commercial banks in the world, like Citigroup and JP Morgan Chase Manhattan. This is an era of financed crime, and in the financing of crime, the Federal Reserve Board does not play the part of a disinterested spectator. The powers vested in the Federal Reserve Board seem to me highly dangerous, especially where there is political control of the board. The Federal Reserve Act seems to me to open the way to a vast inflation of the US dollar. The Federal Reserve Act seems to me to contain features and to rest upon principles in the highest degree menacing to our prosperity, to stability in business, and to the general welfare of the people of the United States. The government is in the banking business as never before. Against its will, it has been made the backer of smugglers, speculators, and swindlers in all parts of the world. Through the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve banks, the riffraff of every country is operating on the public credit of this United States government. Meanwhile, and on account of it, we ourselves in the midst of the greatest depression we have ever known. At no time in our history has the general welfare of the people of the United States been at a lower level of the mind of the people so filled with despair. The whole scheme of the Federal Reserve Bank with its commercial paper basis is an impractical, cumbersome machinery, simply a cover to find a way to secure the privilege of issuing money and to evade payment of as much tax upon circulation as possible. It will mean continued shortage of actual money and further extension of credits, for when there is a lack of real money, people have to borrow credit to their cost. I denounce the Federal Reserve Bill as an outrage on our liberties and will make the following prediction. Long before we wake up from our dreams of prosperity through an inflated currency, our gold which alone could keep us from catastrophe, will have vanished and no rate of interest will tempt it to return. I believe that the National Bank Depositors of the United States are entitled to know what the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve banks are doing with their money. There are millions of national bank depositors in this country who do not know that a percentage of every dollar they deposit in the member bank of the Federal Reserve System goes automatically to American agents of the foreign banks, and that all their deposits can be paid away to foreigners without their knowledge or consent by the crooked machinery of the Federal Reserve Act and the questionable practices of the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve banks. The Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve banks have been international bankers from the beginning, with the United States government as their enforced banker and supplier of currency. But it is nonetheless extraordinary to see these 12 private credit monopolies buying the debts of foreigners against foreigners in all parts of the world and asking the government of the United States for new issues of Federal Reserve notes in exchange for them. Federal Reserve notes are taken from the United States governments in unlimited quantities. Is it strange that the burden of supplying these immense sums of money to the gambling fraternity has at last proved too heavy for the American people to endure? Would it not be a national calamity if the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve banks should again bind this burden down on the backs of the American people, and by means of the long rawhide whips of the credit masters, compel them to enter another future endless years of slavery? They are trying to do that now. At the present time, behind the scenes in the Federal Reserve banks, there is a night and day movement of collateral. Cleaning up this mess consists in fooling the people and making them pay a second time for the bad foreign investments of the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve banks. Is it not high time that we had an audit of the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve banks and an examination of all our government bonds and securities and public monies, instead of allowing the corrupt and dishonest Federal Reserve Board and Federal Reserve banks to speculate with those securities and this cash in the notorious open discount market of New York City? Every effort has been made by the Federal Reserve Board to conceal its power, but the truth is the Federal Reserve Board has usurped the government of the United States. It controls everything here, and it controls all our foreign relations as well. It makes and breaks governments at will. No man and no body of men is more entrenched in power than the arrogant credit monopoly which operates the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve banks. These evildoers have robbed this country of more than enough money to pay the national debt. What the national government has permitted the Federal Reserve Board to steal from the people should now be restored to the people. The people have a valid claim against the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve banks. If that claim is enforced, Americans will not need to stand in the breadlines or to suffer and die of starvation in the streets. And this goes for everyone in the world, not only Americans. Homes will be saved, families will be kept together, and children will not be dispersed and abandoned. The Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve banks owe the United States government an immense sum of money. We ought to find out the exact amount of the people's claim. We should know the amount of the indebtedness of the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve banks to the people, and we should investigate this treacherous and disloyal conduct of the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve banks. Do you know why taxes are raised? They are raised to shut out the flood of Federal Reserve goods pouring in here from every quarter of the world. Cheap goods produced by cheaply paid foreign labor on unlimited supplies of money and credit sent out of this country by the dishonest and unscrupulous Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve banks. So, to all those foolish people out there that blame foreigners for our problems and blame cheap labor and exportation of jobs outside of whatever country you live in to other countries, it is the Federal Reserve and your central bank that is creating this problem. And then on top of that, they have been able to convince the foolish, small-minded people of their country that the problem is a foreign-based problem to cause division and to divide us, when the problem is being caused by these banks and these unscrupulous, immoral bankers. When you find the words made in China. That means made on the public credit of the United States government, paid to Chinese firms, and American money taken from the confiscated bank deposits of the American people. The people of the United States are being greatly wronged. If they are not, then I do not know what wronging the people means. People have been driven from their employment. They have been dispossessed of their homes. They've been evicted from their rented quarters. They have lost their children. They have been left to suffer and to die for lack of shelter, food, clothing, and medicine. The wealth of the United States and the working capital of the United States has been taken away from them and has either been locked in the vaults of certain banks and the great corporations or exported to foreign countries for the benefit of foreign customers of those banks and corporations. So far as the people of the United States are concerned, the cupboard is bare. It is true that the warehouses and coal yards and grain elevators are full, but the warehouses and coal yards and grain elevators are padlocked, and the great banks and corporations hold the keys. The sack of the United States by the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve banks, and the sack of the entire world by central banks are the greatest crimes in history. Through the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve banks, and central banks all over the world, people are losing the rights guaranteed to them by their constitutions. Their property has been taken away from them without due process of law. Common decency requires us to examine the public accounts of the government and to see what crimes against public welfare have and are being committed right now. What is needed all over the world is return to the sovereign constitutions of sovereign states. We need to have a complete divorce of banks and states. The oil struggles that were fought out here must be fought again. Independent treasury should be reestablished all over the world, and governments should keep their own money under lock and key. Asset currency, the device of the swindler, should be done away with. Government should buy gold and issue the currency on it. The business of independent bankers should be restored to them. Central banks should be abolished and state boundaries should be respected. Bank reserves should be kept within the borders of sovereign states whose people own them, and this reserved money of the people should be protected so that international bankers and acceptance bankers and discount dealers cannot draw it away from them. The exchanges should be closed while we are putting our global financial affairs in order. The Federal Reserve Act should be repealed, and Federal Reserve banks having violated their charters should be liquidated immediately. Faithless government officers who have violated their oaths of office should be impeached and brought to trial. Unless this is done all over the world, I predict that people, outraged, robbed, pillaged, insulted, and betrayed as they are in their own land, will rise in their wrath and send leaders who will sweep away the money changers out of the temple. That brilliant speech I just recited was not my own, but there was a reason that I wanted to recite it without telling you who wrote it before I revealed this fact. And the reason being that this speech, as you probably thought about when you were listening to it, is just as relevant today as the day it was written. It was actually written and spoken on the floor of the U.S. Congress in June of 1932 by Congressman Louis T. McFadden. And while I did not recite the speech, the entire speech, it was just snippets of the speech. It basically was taken verbatim from his speech, along with the majority of it was Louis T. McFadden's, but there was also a couple sentences that were also recited by other U.S. congressmen as well during that particular time in U.S. history. So, and then there was only, I think, one sentence in that entire speech that I kind of modified to make it more relevant to today. And also, there's a part I said made in China instead of made in Germany to make it more relevant today. But other than that, it was basically verbatim his speech with a couple snippets of other U.S. congressmen's sentiments about the U.S. Fed Reserve. And what's remarkable is that that speech was given on the floor of U.S. Congress in 1932, so 80 years later, we still have learned nothing from our past, nothing from the duplicitous nature of central banks and commercial banks in the 1930s. We haven't learned anything because we made the same mistakes, because we find ourselves in the exact same situation that Congressman McFadden excoriated the central banks and warned us against 80 years ago, and we didn't have any foresight to know our history, to learn our history. So that really tells us a couple of things. Number one, it tells us that the bankers have controlled our education, as I've made a video about this in the past, and have wiped our education clean of all relevant history of their wrongdoings, their misdeeds, and the truth, most importantly, the truth of how they operate today. Because what McFadden said 80 years ago still basically is in existence today as far as the modus operandi of all the central and commercial banks today. So we haven't learned anything in 80 years. And then what's remarkable as well is that congressmen, instead of being pawns in the chess game for the bankers and bowing down to the bankers like they do today, actually fought the bankers back then. But our political, so it tells us a little bit about, or actually a lot about, how our political system has changed dramatically. So now the politicians are working for the bankers instead of fighting them. And, most importantly also, it tells you the level of awareness, too, back then. So not only did the politicians know, but the majority of people knew about the evil doings of the bankers back then. And now almost nobody knows. Even when you tell them, they continue to deny it. That's how brainwashed they've been through the, political system, through the education system. So please leave comments below and let me know what you think about this. Let me know if you've never heard these speeches before, what you think about the fact that we were warned 80 years ago and we still have learned nothing. And leave a comment below whether or not you will pass this information on to your family and friends if you haven't, if this is the first time you're learning about this information. Okay, so please comment below. As I said, if you're watching this on YouTube, thanks for watching, and until next time, have a great day. So long.